What's up, guys? Today I'm going to start working some more on the BP4W. So as you can see, I already have pretty much everything stripped down on it. Okay, I am going to do a head gasket on it, so that's my next step, is going to be removing the cylinder head. So there is a sequence you're technically supposed to follow when removing these cylinder head bolts. I'm going to try to put a photo up on the screen, and I'm going to follow that as I take these bolts out. As I'm doing this, I'm making sure that I'm cracking every bolt loose before fully removing them. So I crack every bolt loose in order per the diagram, and then I go ahead and fully remove all of them once they're all cracked loose. Once you have all the bolts out, you can go ahead and remove the cylinder head. It's not very heavy, especially when you have the intake and exhaust manifold removed like I do. I just pulled straight up on it. I didn't have to pry or anything like that, and it came loose pretty easy. Now it's time to clean the block. So I know everyone has their own method on how to do this, but what I did is I started off with a razor blade and just went around the block getting some of the bigger pieces of the gasket material off. And then once I was satisfied with that, I moved on to a Scotch-Brite pad, and I probably scrubbed this thing for about 45 minutes until I thought it was clean enough. And then something else I did but did not record is I did make a couple passes with a sanding block with 320 grit sandpaper while continuously checking with a machinist level, like a flat edge ruler, and using a feeler gauge until I was pretty certain it was as flat as I could get it by hand. I accidentally filmed this in vertical instead of horizontal. However, this is what the block looked like when I was all finished. Pretty good. Now that the block is done and ready to go, it's time to move on to the cylinder head, and I'm going to be replacing the valve stem seals on this, which means I have to take everything apart, change the seals, and then put it all back together. So the first thing I wanted to do was just give this thing a nice exterior cleaning, and then something I also noticed that I needed to clean when I removed the cylinder head was that the coolant passages were pretty crappy. It looks like someone has been filling it with water, whoever owned it before me. So I went ahead and tried my best with a pick to scrape out some of the bigger pieces, blow it out with shop air, kind of rinse and repeat that process to get it as clean as I could. I understand a hot tank would be optimal in this situation, but I don't have that resource available to me. After just a little bit of scrubbing with a brush and some cleaning solvent, this thing actually cleaned up really nice. I was really impressed with how it came out. As far as the coolant passages go, I'm just going to go ahead and run a coolant flush once the engine is in the car and running, and continue to do so throughout its life to try and clear all that crap out as best I can. Now I'm going to disassemble the head to get access to the valve stem seals. So to start, I need to remove the camshaft, but to do that, I have to remove the camshaft caps. So there is a proper sequence you need to follow when doing that. Pause it. There it is. For the orientation of that diagram, the intake cam has to be on top and the exhaust cam has to be on the bottom. Also get yourself a organizer tray or a piece of cardboard to help lay out all the pieces, because every cap you take off needs to go back in the exact same spot you took it off from and facing the same direction. They are labeled, but I drew arrows on mine just to be safe. When you go to loosen these in the proper sequence, make sure to crack all of them loose before fully removing them. So as you can see, I crack it loose, move on to the next one, crack it loose, and I do that with all of them until all of them are cracked loose, and then after that, I go ahead and fully remove them. This is just supposed to help prevent damage to the camshaft that could potentially happen if you were just to zap them all out super fast. Now that the bolts are loose, I can go ahead and remove the intake cam caps, and as you can see, I'm laying these out in a certain way so I know that when I go to reassemble it, none of the caps will get mixed up or get put on the wrong spot or backwards or whatever. Whatever your method is, just make sure you're organized with these pieces so they go back the exact same way they came off. These caps should just pull off. I did have to pull out the rubber mallet for a few of them, but after a few whacks, they came loose and then just pulled right out. No big deal. Once all the caps are removed, I can go ahead and just pull the camshaft right out. Moving on to removing the exhaust cam, it's pretty much identical to removing the intake cam. Just follow the same steps, crack the bolts loose in the proper order, then fully remove them, be organized with your caps. The only difference the exhaust cam has is it has this plug back here where the cam angle sensor would be. Once you remove that cap, the plug will just come right out. It's really not a big deal. Otherwise, everything's the same. The exhaust cam is a little bit longer, so I don't really think you could get it mixed up with the intake cam, but still, just organize everything, put it with the exhaust cam caps, and you'll be good. So here is what my tray looks like with both cams removed, and as you can see, my caps are nicely organized in their respective spots. Now I can go ahead and start removing the lifters so I can get access to the valve springs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Flying Miata valve spring compressor kit that they make. I'm going to show you a little bit how to use it in this video, but they have a really in-depth YouTube video on their channel if you really want to learn how to use it better. But first things first, I need to go ahead and remove the lifters, and you can use any magnet or this screwdriver they provide in their kit, and they will just pull the lifters right out. Once you have all the lifters removed, you can go ahead and take the main piece of the tool here, and you go ahead and you slip it over the camshaft cap dowels that are on the head, and you screw it in with the OEM camshaft cap bolts and just kind of snug it up. You don't want to get it super crazy tight, just snug on the head. Once you have the tool properly mounted and have the compressor piece on top of the spring plate, you can go ahead and thread in the bolt that they provide with some lubrication, and then just use your ratchet and just use it like you're tightening, and it will go ahead and it will compress that spring down. And as you can see, it releases the tension on those little retaining keepers, so then you can remove them. So keep in mind, you have 16 valves and you have to do this 16 different times if you're going to do them all, okay? Trying to get these out 16 different times without a magnetic bit screwdriver is probably hell. I would not recommend doing this without a magnetic bit screwdriver. It made this a lot easier, and even then it was challenging getting them back together, but I can't imagine doing it without a magnetic tip screwdriver. And with the keepers removed, you can then, with the magnet, just remove the spring plate and the spring, and then the valve will just fall right out the bottom. And again, rinse and repeat this on all 16 of these. It's the same process for all of them. Here is what my tray looked like once I had everything disassembled, and again, just like the camshaft caps, these valves, the springs, the lifters, everything needs to go back in the exact same spot you removed it from. So make sure you're good with your organization and you have it laid out in a specific way, so when you go to reinstall it, everything will go back in the exact spot you removed it from. Once you have the spring and the spring plate removed, you can finally access the seals. So when you remove these, it was kind of difficult to record how to do it with one hand, but pretty much just lightly squeeze them with pliers and pull up while kind of rotating back and forth and give them some wiggles, and eventually it will break free and just pull out. Okay, and so after doing that 16 times, I finally have the head completely disassembled, and next thing I want to do is kind of clean it up a little bit before I start reassembly, mainly down here where the valve stems kind of seat, whatever that area is called. It's pretty bad, as you can see, so I went ahead and scrubbed with some Scotch-Brite and a little elbow grease, and as you can see, those two on the left are after I cleaned, and these two on the right here are before I cleaned. After cleaning the head for a second time, I'm almost ready for reassembly. However, there's one more thing I want to do first, and that's lapping the valves. Now, I've never done this before. This is my first time, so if my technique looks kind of ass, that's probably why. If you want a more in-depth explanation on how to do this, I'd recommend just looking up a more specific YouTube video on valve lapping. But essentially, you put this valve lapping compound on the valve, you put the valve in the corresponding hole you took it out of. Again, just like the camshaft caps, don't mix these up. Everything goes in the same place you removed it from. But you put the valve in, and you use the tool that comes in the kit, and you pretty much just spin the valve by hand back and forth against the seat in the head. And doing that with the compound on will smooth out the surface on both ends, and you continue to do this until you are satisfied with the results. Now, did I do a perfect job? Probably not. However, it's definitely way better than it was before I lapped them. Once you think you've gone on long enough, you can remove the valve, wipe off the compound, and just take a look at it and see if you like how smooth it is. Go ahead and feel it, see if it feels smooth. If you want to go ahead for another run, you can put it back in and keep lapping it, but I think these look pretty good. And then as far as the cylinder head side of things, as you can see, they look pretty good. So what you're looking for is that bigger ring there that the valve actually seats into. That's what we're checking right now for smoothness. I did all 16 of them. They all came out pretty nice. As you can see when you zoom in, that looks really nice and smooth. You just want to check, make sure there's not any weird imperfections or anything random that if you went a couple more passes over, you could maybe smooth out. But all of mine came out pretty well, I think. Now that that's all taken care of, it's time for reassembly. So of course I'm starting with the valve stem seals first. I'm using a little bit of oil on and around it to help lubricate it when I go to push it in to make it a little easier. I'm using some pliers to gently lower it down into its hole where it needs to be pressed in. I am not using the pliers to press it in, as that can damage the seal, just putting it in the spot. I will use my finger to then lightly push on the seal. When you do this, you'll kind of hear a click and feel a pop, and you'll know the seal is in place. It does not take very much pressure to get it to go into place. One important thing to note is that on the 1.8, the exhaust and the intake valve stem seals are two different part numbers, so make sure you're paying attention when installing these. After installing all 16 new valve stem seals, I can go ahead and put the valves and springs back where they belong. So as you can see, the valve and the spring are where they go. I'll go ahead and put the spring retainer plate back in. And then this is going to be just like disassembly as far as setting up the tool goes. You'll go ahead and put that compressor piece on top of the spring plate, and you'll go ahead and you'll compress the spring down. And there's those little notches that are cut into the valve stem. You just want to compress the spring just enough to where those notches are visible so that you can put the keepers back in, because the keepers lock into those notches, and that's what keeps everything from falling apart. Something Flying Miata mentions that I find really helpful and I would recommend doing is putting a little bit of grease on the valve stem itself where the keepers actually go. This will help the keepers stay in place and not fall out when you're decompressing the spring or installing the other keeper. The grease just helps the keepers stay in their spot. Once your spring is compressed and you have some grease on your valve stem, you can go ahead and start putting the keepers back in. Now, this part can be pretty challenging. It was the hardest part for me, at least. Just like with the disassembly, I would highly recommend using a magnetic tip screwdriver for this. It still is hard, even with a magnetic tip screwdriver. I even have to use a pick on some of these and kind of use two tools to help guide it in its spot. The grease really does help on the valve stem, though, because once you get it in its spot, the grease allows it to stay there and it won't fall out. So that is really helpful when doing this. Now, once you kind of get that second keeper in place, as you can see there, it's very roughly in its spot. You can go ahead and decompress the spring. And then what that will do is, even if it's not perfectly in its spot, the decompressing of the spring will kind of force those keepers right where they need to go, and they'll be forced into their respective spots. And this is what it should look like when you've finished and it's assembled properly. After doing that 16 times, all of the valves and springs are locked in place, and I can now focus on installing the lifters. Reinstalling the lifters is pretty straightforward. Just like everything else in this video, make sure you put these lifters back in the exact same spot that you removed them from. Just put a little bit of oil around the sides of the lifter and they should just push in. Do not force them. If it doesn't go easy, re-lubricate and try again. It should be an easy fit. And this is what it's going to look like once all the lifters are in place. And once you're at this step, it's time to go ahead and start preparing for the camshafts to be installed. I'm putting down some engine assembly lube on the lifters and the oil journals before putting the camshafts in. Obviously, I've had this thing torn apart and cleaned, and there's no oil on the cylinder head, so it's going to be starting dry. So I'm putting this on so it doesn't start dry. I know a lot of people like to argue you can just use engine oil, this and that. Whatever you do, engine oil, assembly lube, whatever, just put something on there, okay? Don't run it dry. Once everything is lubricated, I can go ahead and reinstall the camshaft. It literally just sits right in place. It doesn't need to be forced or anything. As far as the camshaft caps go, it's a good idea to put a little bit of engine oil as lubrication on the threads before threading them in. Okay, make sure you put all the camshaft caps back in the same spot you removed them from, just like everything else in this video. It's also a good idea to put a little bit of that engine assembly lube on the cap before you put it in place. There is a tightening sequence you need to follow when reinstalling these camshaft caps. I'll go ahead and put that on the screen so you guys can see it. So what I do to start is I'm using this little battery ratchet here to quickly snug all the bolts down, just snug, just so they're, threaded in. After that, I move on to a 1/4-inch ratchet and just kind of snug them down by hand. And then once I feel like they're pretty close to where they need to be, I go on the final pass with a torque wrench, and I make one final pass with the torque wrench and call it good. Now, before I can even think about putting the cylinder head back on the block, I want to double check that it is still true and that I did a good job when I was sanding this thing down. So I'm checking with my machinist straight edge and a feeler gauge here to see if there's any weird gaps or warpage or imperfections. And obviously I checked more than just this clip, but I checked every angle multiple times and there's no gaps. I am confident that this head gasket is going to seal. Now at this point, the cylinder head is ready to be reinstalled back on the block. The cylinder head's fully assembled. It's all very clean, as you can see. Look how clean that is. It looks great, in my opinion. I know a machine shop could obviously do a better job, but not everyone has the time, money, resources, whatever, to take it to them to do it. So for me, doing this myself by hand, I was very, very happy with the outcome. I think it looks great. It cleaned up way better than I thought it ever would, and I'm really confident that everything is going to seal and that the cylinder head is going to perform great. Moving back to the block, I can finally install the new OEM Mazda head gasket that I have. These things really only fit one way. They can't really go on backwards, but if you're unsure, just double check that all of your holes are lined up. When you're putting the cylinder head back on, there are the two dowels on the block that will pretty much line up the head, but it is a good idea to just make sure and double check that there is no weird gaps or anything going on between the cylinder head and the block before you start threading any bolts in. Once all the cylinder head bolts are threaded in by hand, they can be tightened down, but it needs to be done in the proper sequence, which we'll go ahead and put on the screen for you to see. And it needs to be done in 3 stages, with the final torque being 56 to 60 foot-pounds. So on the first stage or pass, it needs to be 20 foot-pounds. On the second pass, it needs to be 40 foot-pounds. And then the third pass, final 60 foot-pounds. And I would recommend lubricating the threads with a little bit of oil. It's not necessarily required, but why not? And once all the head bolts are torqued down to spec, the cylinder head is completely installed, and I can now move on to the next part of the project, which is installing the timing and the rest of the engine accessories, which I'm hopefully going to touch base on in the next video. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please like and subscribe. Hopefully this video helps someone or gives someone the confidence to try to do this themselves. Hope you guys have a good one, and I'll see you on the next one.